Prayer is something that we've all done at least once. And it's a core part of living life as a follower of Jesus Christ. But we have a problem. Many of us have been praying in the wrong way. So here's what I mean by that. Typically, when you go into a church setting and you see prayer happen, it's usually in the form of requests. That's how most of prayer is presented in the modern church. That's how most of us approach prayer. We have something that we need, and then we approach God with it, and we ask Him for it, and maybe He gives us what we want, or maybe not. See, the issue is, when we look at how the Bible talks about prayer, that's not exactly the picture that we're given. So we all know the book of Psalms. It's one of the most famous books in the Bible. Probably every single one of us has read it. But what's not as well known is the fact that Psalms wasn't meant to just be read. Psalms was meant to teach us how to pray. All right, so something else we're probably all familiar with is King David. He was the king of Israel. He was described as a man after God's own heart. He was someone that we should all aspire to be like. And he was also a guy who loved to pray. If you've ever read the book of Psalms, you'll know that David was a guy who loved to pray. About half of the entire book of Psalms was written by King David. If you've ever read a Psalm of David before, a prayer of David before, you'll know that often you're going to find encouraging words, you're going to find uplifting words, words of praise to God, words that can make you feel better about your life and what's going on around you. But not all the time. In fact, most often, David's prayers are full of worry and doubt and anxiety and fear, messy stuff. David pouring out his heart with stuff that is not nearly as nice for us to read. These Psalms are trying to teach us what it really means to reach out to God and connect with Him in the way that God desires to be connected with, what true prayer really is. So here, step by step, is how we can pray like David. Step 1, vent your feelings. See, David's prayers are not nice and neat. They're not cookie-cutter prayers. They're full of emotion. They're full of David pouring out his feelings to God about what he's experiencing in the moment and how he actually feels about the hardship he's going through, about his circumstances. They're raw. They're real. You can see this in Psalm 22, for instance. Very famous verses where David says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Now, is it true that God had forsaken him in that point in life? Well, no, God's faithful. And David, later on in the psalm, comes to realize that again. But in that moment, he's pouring out how he really feels. And that's incredibly important for what real prayer actually is. Growing up in a church setting, I somehow got the idea that having an emotional expression to God was a negative thing. That it wasn't good to come to God with how I was actually feeling, but that I should sort that all out before I go to God in prayer. And I think there is a state in which we can kind of be controlled by our emotions. Let our emotions dictate which direction we're going to go. But the way to not let your emotions control you is not by neglecting them entirely. And those are two extremes that I think we can bounce back and forth between in the church and the way we approach our relationships with God, letting our emotions control us and then neglecting them and pretending they don't exist at all. See, we're given this picture in the Psalms of David coming to God with how he feels in the moment and processing through those emotions in relationship with God. And God doesn't appear to be intimidated by David's fears and by his doubts and by his worries and even by David's accusations at points that God has forsaken him or whatever else. God seems to invite David into that process and say, no, let's process this together, you and me. Let's work through this. And if God's not intimidated by David's fears and doubts and feelings, I don't think He's intimidated by ours either. And this is the picture that we're given in Psalms. This is a gift to us to show us what true prayer is really like. And true prayer seems to be coming to God and pouring out our feelings about what we're going through in that moment and processing through them with God. But prayer doesn't stop there. We can't just vent our emotions and leave them swirling around inside of us and just say, okay, that's it, that's good, I can go about my day. Because the second step we see from David is not just venting our feelings, but it's identifying the source of our feelings. In Psalm chapter 3, we see David express his feelings about what he's going through in that moment and immediately move to identify the source of why he's feeling that way. He says, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there's no salvation for him in God." See, he feels afraid. He feels worried that he's been abandoned, that God is not going to come save him, that God is no longer on his side. Many foes are coming after him. And see, it's incredibly important that we don't just vent our feelings and leave them in the swirling mass of confusion in our hearts. Identifying the source of those feelings is the first step to being able to process through them. Because fear and anxiety hold the most power in us when we're not able to identify where they're coming from. When they're left as vague feelings floating around, this sense of dread, this sense of something is coming for us, but we don't know what. When we leave them in that state, when we just go about our days, go about our lives, doing all the stuff that we need to do and never dealing with the things that we're feeling, the sense of fear, the sense of anxiety, the sense of doubt, the sense of worry, it holds incredible power in our hearts and in our minds. And David expresses his feelings, but he also immediately moves to identify the source of why he's feeling that way. And that leads us to the third step. After we vent our feelings to God, after we identify the source of those feelings, we have to move our focus off of our circumstances, off of the source of those feelings, and on to God. On to who God is, on to his character, on to what he's done for us in the past. This is exactly what we see David do again and again in the Psalms, and we see it here in chapter 3 too. After David identifies the source of his feelings in verses 1 and 2, he says in verse 3, "But you, Lord, are a shield around me. You are my glory. You are the one who lifts my head. I call out to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy mountain." See, David here is consciously and intentionally moving his focus off of the circumstances around him that are causing him that fear and that doubt and that worry and that anxiety. And he's moving his focus on to God and who God is and what God has done for him and what he believes God will continue to do for him in the future. He says, "God, you are a shield around me. You are my protection, God. I can't protect myself, but I trust, God, that you can, even in the face of overwhelming odds." He says, "God, you are my glory. You're the only thing about me that is meaningful and relevant. You're the only thing that has brought me to the point I am today. I owe you everything. God, you are the one who lifts my head. You're the one who gives me confidence, who lets me stand tall, God. You're the only one who can give me that confidence. Not in my own ability, God. Not in my own strength, but in you, God." You see how he's shifted his attention off of his circumstances and on to who God is? And once he's done that, it brings him peace and it brings him rest. And you can see the shift in tone that takes place here, now that David has moved his attention off of his circumstances and on to who God is. He says in verse 5, "I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. Therefore I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves all around." See, it's not the relieving of his circumstances that has given him that peace and that confidence. It's the fact that he has now reminded himself of who God is. He's vented his feelings. He's identified the source, and now he's brought God back into the equation. That, "God, you're my protection. I can't handle that, but God, you can. So it's in your hands, and I trust you with that. God, you are my glory. You're my relevance. You're my meaning. God, you're the one who gives me confidence, and so if I can't sustain myself, I'm going to lay down and sleep and leave sustaining me to you. God, I'm going to leave protecting me. I'm going to leave my future in your hands because I can't handle it, but I trust that you're good in the face of my doubts and my confusions." And finally, here, now that David has vented his feelings, now that he's identified the source of his feelings, now that he's moved his attention off of his circumstances and on to God, we find step 4, and that is to actually request something of God. It's only after those first 3 steps that we see David ask something of God. Finally, in verse 7, he says, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. Rise up and deliver me from these circumstances." See, even after all of this processing, it doesn't cancel out his emotions. It doesn't mean his doubt and his worry are just gone. It means he's processing through those things with God. He's including God in the equation again. This is how David prayed. His prayers are so often raw, and they're messy, and they're full of David's feelings in a moment. He's venting those things because he knows that's how God wants us to connect with him. God doesn't want a nice cookie-cutter, pre-prepared prayer given on a platter to him. It's not a cosmic vending machine situation where we punch in the right numbers to get the thing we want from God. God wants connection with us. He wants to hear how we're feeling. He wants to process through those feelings with us. He wants us to be raw and to be real and to be messy with him, because that's what real relationship is like, right? And again and again and again in the book of Psalms, this book that was given to us, not just to be read, but to teach us what it really means to pray. Over and over again, we're going to see David praying like that, with messy feelings, identifying the source of those feelings and always turning his attention to who God is in the midst of all that. And make no mistake about it, requests of God are a core part of what prayer actually is. But it's not the only part. And if that's the only thing we focus on in prayer, we are missing the heart of God for connecting with us. God wants us to be real with him. God wants to connect with us in the midst of what we're experiencing. God wants to show us that he's with us in the midst of all the things we're going through right now. And prayer is an incredible gift to be able to connect with our Creator in that kind of raw, messy, real way. So my challenge to every single one of us today is to get real in the way we connect with God. Don't be afraid to show God your doubts and your fears and your anxiety and your worry. God wasn't intimidated when David showed those things to him, and he's not intimidated by those things in us either. He wants to process through those things with us. So let's vent our feelings. Let's identify why we're feeling that way as we process through those things with God, and let's move our attention off of those things and on to who our God is. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. If you would, before you go, please leave a like and leave a comment down below telling me how you like to connect God best in prayer. As always, you guys, God bless.